In this video we will talk about authentication. The two biggest ways of authentication and the most used are session-based and token-based authentication, but what are those and when do we use each one? Session-based authentication and token-based authentication are two common approaches used to authenticate users in web applications. Let's compare and explain each approach. First, session-based authentication, how it works. In session-based authentication, when a user logs in, the server creates a session for that user and stores it on the server side. The server then sends a session ID, usually stored in a cookie, back to the client. For subsequent requests, the client sends the session ID with each request, allowing the server to identify the user's session and authenticate the user. Sessions are typically stored in server memory, but can also be stored in a database or external cache. Now, what about the pros and cons of the session-based authentication? First, what are the pros of the session-based authentication? Simplicity. Session-based authentication is straightforward to implement, especially with server-side frameworks like Laravel. Built-in security. Sessions are managed by the server, reducing the risk of client-side attacks like XSS, cross-site scripting. What about the cons? Scalability. Storing sessions on the server can lead to scalability issues, especially with large numbers of users. Server overhead. Maintaining session data on the server consumes server resources, which can impact performance. Stateless nature. Sessions rely on server-side state, making it difficult to scale horizontally or deploy across multiple servers. Now, after we have talked and explained everything we need about session-based authentication, let's talk about the token-based authentication and how it works. In token-based authentication, when a user logs in, the server generates a token, e.g., JWT, JSON Web Token, and sends it back to the client. The client stores the token locally, usually in local storage or a cookie, and sends it with each subsequent request in the authorization header. The server validates the token and extracts user information from it to authenticate the user. Tokens are typically signed and encrypted, containing information such as user ID, expiration time, and any additional claims. Now, what are the pros of token-based authentication? Scalability. Since tokens are stateless and self-contained, they can be easily distributed across multiple servers or used in microservices architectures. Performance. Token-based authentication reduces server-side overhead as authentication is handled on the client side. Flexibility. Tokens can be used for authentication and authorization, and can include custom claims to convey additional information. Now, what about the cons? Security concerns. Tokens must be securely stored to prevent theft or tampering. Storing tokens in local storage exposes them to XSS attacks. Token management. Tokens need to be managed, refreshed, and revoked if necessary. This can add complexity to the authentication process. Now let's talk about the real comparison between the two. Security. Session-based authentication relies on server-side storage and is generally more secure against certain types of attacks. Token-based authentication requires careful handling of tokens to prevent security vulnerabilities. Scalability. Token-based authentication is more scalable, making it suitable for distributed systems or microservices architectures. Session-based authentication may encounter scalability issues with large numbers of users. Performance. Token-based authentication tends to be more performant as it offloads authentication logic to the client side. Session-based authentication may incur additional server-side overhead. Implementation complexity. Session-based authentication is simpler to implement, especially with server-side frameworks. Token-based authentication may require more complexity due to token management and security considerations. In summary, both session-based and token-based authentication have their strengths and weaknesses, and the choice between them depends on factors such as security requirements, scalability needs, and the specific use case of the application. Now, after all this theoretical talk, in the next video we will start and make a session-based authentication and test it. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.